events, and publications on a wide array of European topics. For today's webinar, we decided to focus exclusively on healthcare and supply chain resilience, a topic that everyone agrees that is hugely important, but few actually understand the practicalities and complexities behind it. We shouldn't forget that the COVID-19 pandemic was a huge challenge for public health, economic, and social life globally. However, it was also a wake-up call for the European Union in the field of healthcare and the need to have a better supranational framework. It is important to note that the European Commission and Parliament have made important progress in these areas. Second, the pandemic was the ultimate test for supply chain resilience internationally. The challenge was specifically complex for pharmaceutical, biotechnology, and medical device industries operating in a high level of uncertainty. And also, these companies need to anticipate disruptions such as climate events, political and economic upheavals, as well as the fallout of deglobalization practices. Ensuring the smooth supply chain in life sciences is critical not only for businesses, but also for the well-being of customers and clients across the globe. And for today's webinar, we're bringing together the voice of industry, as well as the voice of European policymakers on this extremely important and complex issue. I'm really happy that today we are joined by MEP Tomislav Sokol, who is part of the EPP group in the European Parliament, representing the Croatian Democratic Union. MEP Sokol is the Vice Chair of the Committee on the Internal Market and Consumer Protection, and he's also one of the EPP's leading voices on the parliamentary work on public health and related dossiers. Dr. Sokol also has a doctorate in European Union law. Also, we are joined by Gary Hartnett, who is part of Johnson & Johnson. He's currently VP of Partnerships and External Supply for Janssen Supply Chains. Prior to this role, Gary was General Manager for the Ireland supply chain and also worked for the medical device division of J&J. Thank you both for joining us. Before we jump right into it, very quickly, house rules. Dear friends, just to remind you that this is an interactive webinar. Please share any questions or comments during the discussion. We're live, so please send us or tweet directly, and we'll incorporate your questions in the second part of our webinar. So, without further ado, Tomislav, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I will have to apologize that I will have to leave at around 3:30 because it's a pretty packed schedule today in the European Parliament. But I would like to say some words about what we are currently doing, and that is primarily the Pharma Package, the pharma legislation, because this is something which directly reflects European competitiveness, but also the question of investments into research and development of new medical technologies in Europe. And so, as you know, healthcare is primarily a national competence, but authorization, so approval for putting new medicines on the European market for many medicines, especially the innovative ones, is done on the European level by European Medicines Agency and then the European Commission. And now we are in the process of revising this legislation after around 20 years, a major revision of this. Definitely one of the key objectives should be, at least in my opinion, and that is also stated in the proposal, to strengthening the competitiveness of the European Union and stimulating and incentivizing research into innovation and research into Europe. And definitely, I think this is something which is of utmost importance, and the European Union can really do a lot here. However, it is also true that the Commission's proposal in some areas actually goes in the other direction. So there are positive things, for instance, regulatory sandboxes, where it would be possible to develop new technologies in a more flexible regulatory framework. Also, positive thing is the so-called transferable exclusivity voucher to stimulate development of new antimicrobials, because we know that developing new antimicrobials is a big problem because there are no strong incentives within the market itself to produce something, so we have to do something from the public level. And this voucher, I think, is a good way forward. But there are also some proposals there which definitely go in the other direction. And I think the most important area that I'm referring to is the incentives in terms of regulatory data protection. So regulatory data protection is something that is of extreme importance for predictability for the industry to develop new technologies, to develop new medicines. And the idea of the Commission to reduce this baseline guaranteed period of regulatory data protection is something that definitely is, I believe, not a step in the right direction. I think that predictability is important. I think that we need modulation. So I think that we need to focus on developing technologies in those areas where we have the biggest gaps, and that is primarily rare diseases and pediatrics. But I think the better approach would be to have the same, at least the same baseline for regulatory data protection as it is now in force, and then to add additional years, additional periods of regulatory data protection in those areas where we think that we have to put the biggest focus on. So by doing that, we create predictability for the companies, but also stimulate them to invest more into those areas where we have the biggest needs. So I think that this regulatory framework of the incentives, regulatory data protection, how this is organized, is of extreme importance if we want to stimulate industry to actually innovate and invest into Europe. On the question of so that's one big area that we are now working on. Of course, the other area which is also part of the legislation that I'm working on as the shadow rapporteur of the EPP is the question of shortages. So we are now creating, and the Commission is working on that, on creating this whole new landscape on preventing shortages, on making shortage prevention plans, and on having a much better system of control, of predicting things, but also into making sure that we do not have problems like we had last winter when we were where we ran out of certain very important medicines. And in that sense, I think the proposal goes in the right direction, but some things can also be improved. So, for instance, the idea to make shortage prevention plans for all the medicines, I think, is definitely not feasible. It's not reasonable. So it imposes an disproportionate regulatory burden on the companies. So I believe that we should really focus, for instance, there on those critical medicines. And since now Commission plans to come up with a new list of critical medicines at the beginning of next year, definitely to focus on these medicines in terms of shortage prevention plans and making sure that we don't have problems in terms of access to these medicines. So I think these are the most important things that we are working on now. So in terms of providing incentives for investments into innovation, to development of new medical technologies, bringing these investments to Europe as much as possible, and also having a much better landscape on preventing shortages, on controlling the whole landscape, and making plans, contingency plans, so that this doesn't happen in the future. In more general terms, if I can add, I think that Europe talks a lot about strategic autonomy, but in many things we are definitely going in the opposite direction. So the regulatory burden, the amount of new legislation that is coming is enormous. I think that the European Parliament will only be working on legislative files, so there will be no own initiative reports or nothing else until the end of this Monday, because we have so many legislation that we have to work on at the moment. And all of this creates enormous burden for the industry, especially all of the things which are envisaged by the Green Deal, but also additional things like, for instance, corporate due diligence, new corporate due diligence rules. So it imposes so many obligations of reporting, of keeping different administration, of reporting the same things over and over again, that definitely such a burden is something that does not help European competitiveness. Bigger companies may well be able to cope with that, but definitely small and medium-sized enterprises no. So I think that we really have to think a lot about what we are doing, about how much new burden are we imposing upon the industry, and see whether all of this is counterproductive. Also, if you look at in more general terms, competition is getting stronger. When we speak about medicines, when we speak about healthcare, we are lagging behind the US. We have a lot of data which shows that China is is picking up pace enormously, going much faster. So this is the competition that will have to work in the years to come. Of course, it's not. It should not be our objective to copy China. So we are a democracy. We have a market economy, but definitely some things need to be reconsidered. For instance, the question of reciprocity with China, the question of state aid, for instance. So because if you're competing, but the other side has competitive advantages of, for instance, state aid, state subsidies, and other ways of stimulation from the government. Then this is definitely not an environment where you have a level playing field. So Europe should be definitely thinking more about that as well. So in terms of not imposing unnecessary regulatory burden within Europe, but also thinking on how to regulate and what kind of conditions it should impose on our trading partners as well, because I think the situation that we have now is unsustainable. That doesn't mean that and I don't think that it's a good approach that we now impose obstacles, customs, etc., because this will only bring the prices down, but essentially to see what we can do on European level to be more competitive, so that we can compete under the same conditions. I'm glad that in the speech on the State of the Union, the President of the Commission has emphasized the issue of competitiveness. I hope that this will be also followed with concrete actions. It's good. I hope that political will is there, but definitely we will have to work much more on that in concrete terms, not just in the area of healthcare, but in other areas as well. And when we speak about healthcare and the pharma legislation, so this is something that we already started work on. I already posed my amendments, which go in the direction, as I said, of strengthening predictability, modulating incentives without reducing them, streamlining the procedures and duties of the companies to those areas where we have to give, in which we have to give the priority, but not the others. And definitely we'll see how this comes out in the end. Unfortunately, I have to say, and then I'll finish. The problem is if you propose this kind of legislation in an election year, then some political groups, especially those to the left, like to score political points with that. So what the S&D is doing on the pharma package is very extreme, I would say, to the left, going in the direction which is definitely not pro-competitiveness, but in a completely different direction. So the negotiations will not be easy. The goal is to finish the first reading of the pharma package in the parliament before elections, and then hopefully to start the trialogue after the new commission and parliament is formed. I think there is no chance that we start the trialogue with this parliament and this commission in position. So thank you very much, and of course I'm open to any questions and comments.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tomislav, for this really concise overview. I have many follow-ups, but I picked up a couple of very important keywords here: competitiveness, predictability, also for industry. And I want to involve Gary here. What's your view when we talk about predictability for industry, and how do you see the situation right now, specifically when we talk about security of supply chains?
Yeah, thanks, and very much aligned with a lot of what MEP just mentioned there. But very quickly, let me just tell you a little bit about Johnson & Johnson, or J&J. So Johnson & Johnson is really actively engaged in addressing public health challenges for over 100 years. We're the largest, most diversified healthcare products company, and we take our responsibility seriously to address this critical needs of patients, communities, healthcare providers, and governments across the globe pretty seriously. In J&J, we sell more than 400,000 different products. We deliver about 100,000 orders a day to about over 300,000 commercial customers, ultimately reaching just over 1 billion patients every day. So to do that, we have a lot of manufacturing and distribution sites. We also work with thousands of suppliers, 3PLs, and hundreds of external manufacturers. So to your point, it makes healthcare supply chains pretty complex, okay? Whether it's the smaller ones or whether it's the larger ones that I happen to work with in. And these are very integrated, need highly specialized suppliers, robust safety regulatory requirements that MEP mentioned, and a highly skilled workforce. And if you think about that value chain, any break along the elements of that chain can compromise the entire value chain and put at risk the quality of those medical products or lengthen the time it takes the healthcare professional. So, it is super important to have strong, resilient and sustainable supply chains. And a couple of points around that. Obviously, you need to be able to manage for any disruption event, such as major public health threats that we've had over the last couple of years. And during those severe tests, you need to be able to rely on, I think, a global, diversified, and also a resilient supply chain to ensure you get that security of supply to prevent any medicine shortages. And I guess what's also happening is those healthcare supply chains are evolving and becoming even more complex. There's an accelerating trend towards personalization, customization of healthcare products. We're launching new modalities like cell therapy, robotic surgery, 3D printed medicines and devices, and these require innovative supply chains. In addition to those, we're more used to the high volume existing products, and they require a precise level of responsiveness to demand, enhanced standards for traceability, and manufacturing with distribution capabilities, which are closer to the point of care. So maybe more made to order versus made to stock. So I think companies and organizations like ourselves, we need to make sure that we're constantly evolving to make sure that we can stay responsive to those needs. So, more integration of digital delivery methods and data science to stay resilient, continuously monitoring and tracking emerging risks such as pandemics, natural disasters, cyber threats, geopolitical events, even trade barriers. So what we do is we carefully track all of that right across the global network to ensure we have adequate and effective distribution to minimize disruption. And we have robust business continuity plans to make sure we can manage against that. So a lot of crisis management, a lot of reactivity. At the end of the day, we've got to actively monitor those end-to-end supply chains during those major events to maximize the product availability and ultimately making sure we deliver the right volumes of medical products to the people who need them. So yeah, they're the kind of things we think about when we're thinking about how do we respond to some of those disruptions.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Gary. We've already received a couple of questions from the audience, and I'm aware that Tomislav is short on time, so I'll just go straight at it. We've received the following question: to what extent could the concept of strategic autonomy be adapted or utilized by the EU in relations to supply chains and life sciences? Tomislav, you also mentioned strategic autonomy. Care to elaborate about this?
Yes, I mean, we have to be realistic. I mean, it's impossible for all the reasons that have been mentioned to now force the industry to bring the production to Europe. So definitely that's something which is impossible. So this is so complex. You have so many elements, for instance, in one vaccine or one medicine, that now bringing this by way of kind of decree is definitely impossible and definitely would be counterproductive. So we have to make sure on one side that we stimulate investments into Europe in those areas where it is feasible as much as possible, and but also it's very important in terms of tracking and planning. And I think this is probably the area where Europe has done the most. So we have now the regulation on cross-border health threats. We have the single market emergency instrument now. So we have all of these. So we have all of these things. This whole ecosystem which has been created so that we can identify the problems as soon as possible, hopefully even before they happen, and then to come up with solution, because a lot of things are just a problem of poor planning, lack of coordination, etc. What is also important is that in case of crisis, we don't have problems that we had in 2020 when member states closed off their borders and when we had shortages. So it's of utmost importance that also the single market functions within itself. So I wrote one paper on the question of export restrictions and that the current within the European Union. So which is something that definitely we have to prevent. So we have to prevent that member states stockpile medicines in case of crisis, even if there is a larger need in another member state, like we had in the beginning with medical countermeasures for COVID, etc. So in that sense, I think we need a much more organized approach, stronger coordination. Definitely, it's not enough that we act a posteriori, because we have to work as soon as possible. So I think that the best approach is to have standstill clauses, in a way that if any member states want to impose any kind of export restriction on medicines, this has to be approved by the European Commission, and then the European Commission can look at the whole system, the whole single market, and see where the needs are the biggest. So definitely, I think when you speak about supply chains, so generally trying to be as competitive as possible and provide enough stimulation to bring in as much as possible of the supply chain to Europe. But again, not by decree, not by forcing, but actually by creating this kind of an environment, making sure also that supply chains function within the time of crisis without hindrances, having contingency plans, having stockpiles when necessary, but also of utmost importance is that during crisis we have a single market and not 27 member states, each one of them looking only for its own national interest.
I fully agree. Where do I sign for this statement? Thank you,
but I think
Tomislav.
what has been done, but on medicines, I think we have to do most, because single market emergency instrument doesn't cover medicines. So I think that's definitely not a good thing. So I think that additional work will need to be carried out, so that we prevent at the outset any kind of obstacles forming in case of crisis.
Okay, thanks for this. We're talking about bottlenecks and problems with supply chains. Gary, maybe you can give us some specificity here. What are the key bottlenecks when we talk about medicine supply chains, and how does J&J address those?
Yeah, I think the most important thing for supply chains in terms of the bottlenecks is we need to make sure that we can keep products moving and flowing. So like your bottleneck when you have such a diverse portfolio of products, and most companies are making a large scope of products, like I mentioned previously, the most important thing is to make sure you have a multidimensional approach for it. So as I said, you've got to make sure that you look at it from a global perspective. You look at it, so what we would do is have multiple partners, multiple nodes, multiple locations for making products. Yes, we do keep and track inventory levels, make sure we maintain critical inventory levels and position them in different territories. We work with external suppliers to make sure they have preparedness plans. Because as I said at the start, when you have a value chain that's so complex, upstream and downstream of where you're actually manufacturing, and the products that we make could have many different steps to manufacturing, which could be done in many different locations and have many different raw materials and components in terms of moving them. What you've got to make sure is that each one of those nodes has a kind of a business continuity or resilience plan. And that when you look at it all together, if you have a disruption in that supply chain, that you've scenario planned that to make sure you can respond to it. To make sure that you have, and that might be you keep inventory at different positions. That might mean you have a backup partner that can make that component, or you have a backup you make. If you're making manufacturing a step in the process, instead of having just one location that does that step in the manufacturing process, you might have 2 or 3. So you could push product and you can cope with a disruption in the process, and you can respond quickly at the end of the day, because at the end of the day, our job is to make sure that we don't have any stockouts, and that the patients get the products when they need it, because they're not worried about the value chain. The patients are worried about getting their medical products and medicines. So our job is to make sure we get them there. And so there's a huge amount of kind of, I would say, control tower activity in terms of, you can imagine you're visually looking down at all of this and you're understanding where you have weaknesses or any potential disruptions in those nodes. But it is very complex and it is very much evolving as well. But yeah, they're the type of things that we do on a very practical level.
Okay, roger that. Tomislav, quick question we just received from the audience. Maybe you can make it. Alan online asks, engagement with global supply chains in life sciences will necessitate engagement with not only sympathetic partners in the West, but also the global South and potential rivals such as China. How can we play this role in the EU without making compromises on our values? Very interesting question.
Yes, actually, I have to say I'm in the, let's say, more pragmatic camp. So I think that to be perfectly honest, I think we have to look at our interests first, and I think we're already losing battle to when this battle. Let's say in many parts of the world, because this is not directly related to this question, but I would like to mention it. For instance, in many countries in global south, we come and say you have to change this, you have to change that, introduce human rights protection standards, etc., which is all well and good. But the Chinese come up with concrete money, with concrete investments, with favorable loans, etc. And here you have to make some, you have to have a balanced approach. Of course, we cannot accept everything that sometimes these kind of regimes are doing, but on the other hand, we also have to make sure that we do not destroy ourselves and shoot ourselves in the foot in the process. So I think we have to engage them. We have to see what is the best possible approach and try to find this kind of a balance. There is no one size fits all solution. What I'm seeing, unfortunately, to be perfectly honest, in the last years, that kind of global trends are shifting against the West. And it seems to me that countries which have not been aligned before, like China and India, for instance, China and Russia as well, so they are getting closer and closer together. And for instance, when you speak about Russia and China, China is a big market which needs raw materials, and this is precisely what Russia has. So their economies are very complementary, and we have to be realistic that by bringing those two together, this is something that definitely does not go in our favor. So I think we'll have to be pragmatic. I think we'll have to see what our interests are, try to balance all this. But let's be perfectly honest, we've been doing this also before. I mean, we've been trading and buying gold from OPEC countries, which are definitely not role models for democracy for decades as well. So if such a pragmatic approach is possible there, also here. But when I speak about pragmatic approach, that also doesn't mean that also means trying to find some kind of a reciprocity, so that you don't have a situation where you cannot invest in the other party's market, but they can invest without any kind of limitations in the European market. So I think these are some of the things that we have to take into account, but we need the balanced approach. Europe definitely needs raw materials which does not have access to in Europe, so it has to engage globally, and in doing that we'll also have to make some compromises, to be perfectly honest.
Global engagement and compromises. Okay, thank you for this. Now, Gary, when we talk about the security of supply chains, and now we're talking with a representative from the European Parliament, maybe more specifically from your viewpoint, talking about resilience, what strategies and what specific policies do you think are needed here, especially in the next couple of years?
I'm sorry, I just have to, if I can just say,
yeah, of course,
goodbye, because I have to leave now. Thank you for organizing this. Thank you for also putting this in the forum. So this kind of discussion, I think this is the most important strategic discussion for the future of Europe and for long-term survival. So creating this kind of a landscape where we stimulate investments, where we stimulate innovation, where we have plans, where we address the bottlenecks and see what the problems are, so we have a system which can adapt to these kinds of situations, is of utmost importance for us in the future. So that bottlenecks are not created, that we can see them coming in advance, but also to bring as much investments and as much of the supply chains as possible to Europe, to be less dependent on the others. Of course, in those areas where this is impossible, we'll have to engage others and try to find a balanced approach. So on one side, protecting our geopolitical interests, but also not compromising our values. So I think this will be the crucial exercise in the years to come. I think Europe in general needs a more systematic industrial policy, which goes much beyond what we are doing now. So we have different rules which are not very connected. Sometimes they're coordinated within each other. So I think we need this kind of a systematic approach, and I hope that the new Commission will be able to go in that direction. Thanks.
Thank you, Tomislav, for this really expert intervention, and I wish you all the best. Thanks for joining our webinar. We continue with Gary from J&J. And back to my question, Gary, talking about all of these complexities, if you have a wish list when it comes to specific policies or adequate strategies to address supply chain resilience,
Yeah, no, thank you. And maybe just to kind of, four kind of themes come to my mind. I think the first one we kind of mentioned a little bit already, but just to reinforce it, we need to ensure that we've open global supply chains to allow that free flow of critical materials and goods. So what I mean is having those global and diversified and open supply chains, they're one of the essential basic foundations to ensure predictable and secure flow of medical goods to all patients globally. So leverage the EU's multilateral and bilateral trade negotiations to support open trade flows and a more resilient supply chain at global level. And they might be EU-US Trade and Tech Council, free trade agreements, trade and healthcare initiative at the WTO. And this includes ruling out import-export bans of medicines and ingredients. So we need to keep that moving. So that's kind of one big theme. The second one I would say is, and MEP Sokol mentioned it to a degree, is foster better cross-industry data to enhance demand visibility and strengthen supply chain transparency. So if you want to efficiently stress test your supply chains, we need to accurately predict the patient demand in different countries. And we do that by understanding the availability of materials needed for that production. It could be the case that products in our downstream production processes are purchased from suppliers where we don't have that full visibility to availability and demand by other non-healthcare customers. So the European Shortages Monitoring Platform, or the ESNP, to allow process information and supply and demand of critical medicine products, and also standardized reporting terminology to be used by MAHs and member states, are steps in the right direction. We would also, think we should also use available data for understanding inventory levels and automated shortage alerts. So that's kind of a second big theme, is that visibility. I think another big one is really strengthen the EU industrial global competitiveness. Okay, and what do I mean by that? So a strong life science ecosystem encourages innovation for life-saving medicines, attracts strategic investments, promotes collaboration, and strengthens that pandemic preparedness. So from a J&J perspective, we support policies that enable a strong innovation ecosystem from Europe with global partners. So if we very much focus on Europe and what we can do, to MEP Sokol's point of view, that's a big one we can do. If we encourage these public-private partnerships, a robust intellectual property framework, skills and workforce training, an agile and modern regulatory system, and progressive market conditions, such as quality and security of supply in public tenders and pricing and reimbursement systems that recognize and reward innovation. It also includes those government incentives to expand R&D and manufacturing, such as economic, tax, and trade policies that incentivize companies such as ourselves to invest in Europe. We consider this more efficient than government mandates to produce in Europe. So patient access to medicines and treatments should not be jeopardized by where a medicine is manufactured, because, at the end of the day, we need the patients to get it. I think the last one to reemphasize, I touched on it a little bit, is we need to enable an agile, robust, and flexible EU pharmaceutical regulatory framework. And Amy Sokol was very strong on that, and I support that. We established global regulatory standards to help level the playing field and ensure compliance. So if we can do that really well, this framework should provide an expedited approval process for innovative manufacturing solutions and support process and product innovations that can reduce those lead times. And it allows then for expedited variations and procedure simplification for alternative sites, sources, logistic partners, and facilitate the use of digital information and big data, i.e. e-leaflets. So if we can do that and move towards that kind of global regulatory convergence and mutual recognition agreements with other global partners, that have those high quality regulatory systems, that's going to help us, make EU more competitive, but ultimately make sure we can be more resilient supply chains and we can get the products to patients when they need them.
I really liked your second point about competitiveness, and this is something which also Tomislav referenced, even though briefly, about the need for our own industrial policy. But I think you're based in Dublin, you're in Ireland, and I think you've had a really good overview of how supply chains work in the EU, outside of the EU. Maybe focusing on competitiveness a bit more. How do you see the EU right now when it comes to its positioning compared to other geopolitical actors, and what are the EU's biggest strengths when it comes to this, and how can we improve?
Yeah, look, I think obviously we're, within the EU, we have the European Union. Okay, so we have a mechanism, to reinforce that unity. And I think that we're a global organization, so we have a global footprint, and we have employees working all across the globe, and we supply to all countries across the globe. I think from an EU competitiveness, it's really about the things I mentioned. The most important thing we can do is build a really strong, healthy life science ecosystem. Because if you have that, you're going to encourage innovation. And that's what we need. Like, the things are evolving so quickly. We need an ecosystem that's working really well, that allows us to be able to research and develop, manufacture, distribute, and access the medicines that we need. Okay, and if we can reduce complexity and thrive for simplicity in that space, and have that kind of heartbeat that allows that, so that, promoting public-private partnerships, a robust intellectual property framework, really driving towards skills and workforce training. So making sure that the pipeline coming through the academic systems and universities is getting best in class talent. That agile and modern regulatory system that I referred to previously. And then those progressive market conditions, such as that quality and security of supply. So that end-to-end base and reimbursement systems that recognize and reward that innovation. If we can do that, and through governments incentivize the R&D and manufacturing footprint, etc., that strengthens more and more the ecosystem. And I think also, recognizing that we live in a global ecosystem. So, keeping those open trade, keeping those mechanisms flowing, that allows us to be seen as open, as innovative, and as a good place to foster development of those resilient end-to-end value chains.
We have a question which was pending for the last 15 minutes from our audience, coming from Sam. And Sam asks us, although the COVID-19 pandemic was a significant and unprecedented stress test for global supply chains in life sciences, the international community passed the test, but challenges remain. What are the most important lessons learned from the pandemic when it comes to supply chains? And what are the greatest challenges today for the global supply chains in life sciences? Thoughts on that, Gary?
Yeah, I think we learned a lot.
It's a biggie.
Yeah. Like, I think the most important thing we learned, if you remember going, if you think back into those early days of the pandemic, we were really wondering, gosh, how are we going to respond to this? Okay, how are we going to get a vaccine or a treatment for COVID? And what really happened is everybody came together. All regions globally came together. Government, industry, academia, healthcare came together to solve the problem, and did it at a breakneck pace that was never seen before. So it takes years and years to develop a normal vaccine or a product, and to test it and to get it out to patients. And we did that faster than we have ever did before by distance. So it shows that when we work together globally, we can solve the big problems. Okay, so that's what it taught us, is that we can actually get innovative products to market to solve real public health problems really quickly if we work well together, and everybody's focused on a specific mission and purpose. So that's the number one thing. I would say, in terms of, it taught us as well that from a supply chain perspective, we need to have those open trade, because what we found is that we were having certain countries or certain nodes that were manufacturing particular components, whether they were vials for the vaccine or whether they were caps for the vaccine, etc. And that we needed to make sure that we worked together to understand where we were having shortages, or how we can build supply or work together across the globe to build new locations to be able to manufacture the capacity that we needed. So it did show us that, that we take some time to develop a resilient supply chain for that vaccine. So putting those supply chains together are quite complex, as I spoke about. So it takes a little bit of time. So when we really looked at our supply chains that we currently had before the pandemic, and when we took a breath coming out of the pandemic with our non-vaccine supply chains, we kind of said to ourselves that let's have another look at them. Are they really resilient? Do we really know all our tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, our sub-suppliers all the way through our value chain? How robust are they? Can we work with them to make sure they're more resilient? Gosh, instead of just having one node for that supplier, one node for manufacturing that step, maybe we need to have a couple of more. So we learned a lot about how to monitor and measure. So we were always focused on having safe, compliant, and being able to supply well and measuring those for getting life-changing medicines and medical products to patients. But then we became more focused on, well, how can we be more agile? How can we be more responsive to disruptions? How can we scenario plan that to make sure we're more prepared? So a lot of organizations really started to look at how they were organized, about their footprint across the globe, about how many much business continuity they had for different parts of the globe, and actually have really prepared plans to be able to react to disruptions and events. And how we manage our critical inventory as well, and how we partner and work with each of those countries and locations and healthcare providers as well. So I think we've learned a huge amount from it. We're still in the middle of actually continuing to learn, and we've shared that, I think, very well in the healthcare industry to help support each other and lift each other. And I think we'd be much better prepared for the next pandemic. Hopefully there isn't one coming, but should our next one arrive, I think we'll be in a better position to respond.
Fantastic. Gary, I think in the last couple of minutes, you gave one of the best overviews on challenges and also lessons learned. And Gary, once again, I want to thank you for your participation today. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our webinar. My name is Dimitar Ilkov. We just had MEP Tomislav Sokol, as well as Gary from J&J. And thank you again for joining us today. We keep available next couple of weeks with events and pre-Christmas activities. So stay tuned until the rest of the year, and all the best from the Martin Center, and have a lovely day.